Welcome back, brave souls, to BitBlitz Horror, where the witching hour is perpetual, and the monsters in your closet are just itching to say hello. Tonight, we're descending further into the realm of fear with 3 twisted stories that will grip your imagination and test your nerves. Will you make it through our nightmarish tour, or will you succumb to the terror first? Before we unravel the sinister details, remember to like this video and subscribe if you dare to keep the nightmares rolling. Trust me, this new batch of horror tales will haunt your dreams, and you won't want to face them alone. Brace yourselves, the shivers are about to begin. Story number 1: The Hungry Silence. The incessant hum of the white noise machine filled my apartment, a constant companion in the fight against the encroaching quiet. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its second hand ticking away relentlessly, each movement a small victory against the silence that threatened to devour us all. It had been 3 years since the quiet began. At first, we thought it was a blessing, a respite from the cacophony of modern life. But we soon learned that silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It had become something more, something hungry. I remember the day it all changed. I was walking home from work, my noise-canceling headphones firmly in place, when I noticed something odd. The streets were eerily still, devoid of the usual urban symphony. I pulled off my headphones, and that's when I saw it, or rather, didn't see it. A man stood frozen on the sidewalk ahead of me, his mouth open in a silent scream. As I watched in horror, his body began to fade, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. The silence had taken him. Panic spread quickly after that. Scientists scrambled for explanations, governments issued warnings, and people began to make noise, any noise, just to stay alive. Music blared from every home, car horns honked incessantly, and people shouted meaningless conversations at all hours of the day and night. But the silence was patient. It waited for moments of quiet, for the split second when a battery died or someone drifted off to sleep. Then it would strike, leaving nothing behind but empty clothes and unanswered questions. I shook my head, forcing myself back to the present. Dwelling on the past wouldn't help me survive. I checked my watch, 10:15 p.m. Time for my nightly routine. I moved to the kitchen, my footsteps deliberately heavy on the creaking floorboards. The refrigerator hummed reassuringly as I opened it, grabbing a can of energy drink. I needed to stay awake, to keep making noise. As I popped the tab on the can, a sharp hiss cut through the air. I savored the sound, knowing it might have just saved my life. The carbonated liquid fizzed as I poured it into a glass, adding to the symphony of survival that filled my small living space. The TV in the corner played an old sitcom, laugh track blaring at inappropriate moments. I didn't bother watching. The content didn't matter, only the noise it produced. Beside it, a radio crackled with static-filled music, slightly out of sync with the television's audio. I settled into my worn armchair, surrounded by my noisemakers. Wind chimes hung from every available surface, tinkling softly in the breeze from the constantly running fan. A metronome ticked away on the coffee table, its steady rhythm a counterpoint to the arrhythmic beeping of my various electronic devices. As I sipped my drink, I couldn't help but wonder how long we could keep this up. How long before the constant noise drove us all mad? How long before the silence found a way to consume us all? A sudden lull in the TV's audio made my heart race. I quickly grabbed a nearby tambourine, shaking it vigorously until the sound returned. Crisis averted, but for how long? I thought about my neighbor Tom. We'd developed a system of checking on each other, tapping on the shared wall every hour. His last tap had been late, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Setting down my drink, I moved to the wall, rapping my knuckles against it in our prearranged pattern. 1 2 3 pause, 1 2. I waited, straining my ears for a response over the cacophony of my apartment. Nothing. I tried again, louder this time. Still no response. Panic began to rise in my throat, threatening to choke me. I had to check on him, but leaving my noisy sanctuary was risky. Steeling myself, I grabbed my emergency backpack. It contained a portable speaker, extra batteries, and an air horn, essential survival gear in this new world. I slung it over my shoulder and approached my front door. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and stepped out into the hallway. The silence hit me like a physical force, pressing against my eardrums. My own apartment building, once filled with the sounds of life, had become a tomb. I moved quickly to Tom's door, the portable speaker in my backpack playing a loop track of city sounds. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the quiet corridor. Reaching Tom's apartment, I pounded on the door. "Tom!" I shouted, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the oppressive silence. "Tom, are you there?" No answer. With shaking hands, I tried the doorknob. It turned easily, unlocked. Dread pulled in my stomach as I pushed the door open. The silence inside was absolute. No TV, no radio, no white noise machine. Just empty, terrible quiet. "Tom?" I called again, my voice cracking. I moved through the apartment, the city sounds from my backpack seeming to fade with each step. In the living room, I found Tom's noise machines, all dead or silent. And there, on the couch, lay a pile of empty clothes, all that remained of my neighbor. A sob caught in my throat. Tom was gone, taken by the silence. And I was alone in a quiet apartment, my own noisemaker seemingly ineffective against the hungry void. I had to get out. Now, turning to leave, I froze. The sound from my backpack had stopped. The silence pressed in, hungry and waiting. I fumbled for the air horn on my belt, my fingers clumsy with fear. Just as I felt the silence begin to tug at me, I managed to press the button. The air horn's blast was deafening in the quiet apartment, and I felt the silence recoil. I ran, not bothering to close Tom's door behind me. The air horn blared in my hand as I sprinted down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the street. I didn't stop until I reached the center of town, where the noise never ceased. The town square had become a refuge of sorts, a place where people gathered to make communal noise. Drums beat a constant rhythm, bells rang, and voices chanted meaningless words, anything to keep the silence at bay. I collapsed onto a bench, my lungs burning and the air horns slipping from my numb fingers. A woman nearby gave me a knowing look and handed me a small bell. I nodded my thanks, too winded to speak, and began to ring it weakly. As my breathing steadied, I looked around at my fellow survivors. We were a ragged bunch, dark circles under our eyes from lack of sleep, voices hoarse from constant use. But we were alive, and in this world, that was no small feat. A man with wild eyes and unkempt hair approached me, gesticulating wildly. "It's getting stronger," he shouted over the din. "The silence, it's learning, adapting. Our noise isn't enough anymore." I wanted to dismiss him as a madman, but deep down, I feared he was right. The silence was changing, becoming more aggressive. It used to wait for true quiet, but now it could strike in the briefest lull, the smallest gap between sounds. As if to prove the point, a scream cut through the noise of the square. We all turned to see a young man fading away, his cries for help growing fainter as his body became transparent. The music box he had been winding lay silent on the ground. Panic rippled through the crowd. The volume increased as people desperately tried to make more noise, to ward off the encroaching silence. But I could feel it there, waiting in the spaces between sounds, in the milliseconds between heartbeats. I closed my eyes, trying to think. We couldn't go on like this forever. The human body wasn't meant to live without silence, without rest. We needed a solution, a way to fight back against this unnatural quiet. Opening my eyes, I saw a flyer plastered to a nearby wall. It was faded and water-stained, but I could still make out the words. Soundwave Project, volunteers needed for experimental defense system. Hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe this was the answer we'd been looking for. I memorized the address on the flyer, knowing I'd have to make the journey soon. But not tonight. Tonight I needed to rest, as much as one could rest in this noisy world. I found a spot in one of the communal sleeping areas that had been set up around the square. Rows of cots filled a large tent, each equipped with a personal white noise machine. It wasn't much, but it was safer than trying to sleep alone. As I lay down, the sounds of the square muffled but still audible through the tent walls. I couldn't help but wonder about the Soundwave Project. What were they planning? Could they really find a way to defeat the silence? Sleep came in fits and starts, my body jerking awake at every change in the ambient noise. In my dreams, I saw Tom fading away, his mouth open in a silent scream. I saw streets full of empty clothes, the silence having taken their owners. And I saw myself slowly disappearing, becoming one with the hungry quiet. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The white noise machine beside my cot had stopped. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for the switch, acutely aware of the silence pressing in around me. Just as I felt the quiet begin to tug at my edges, the machine sputtered back to life. I let out a shaky breath, my body covered in cold sweat. It had been close, too close. As the adrenaline faded, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly on the edge of oblivion. I had to find the Soundwave Project. Whatever they were working on, it had to be better than this endless, exhausting noise. With renewed determination, I gathered my few belongings and prepared to leave the relative safety of the square. The address on the flyer was on the outskirts of town, a journey that would be dangerous but necessary. As I stepped out of the tent, the noise of the square washed over me. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt oppressive. We were all just screaming into the void, hoping it wouldn't swallow us whole. I adjusted my backpack, checked my noisemakers, and took a deep breath. Whatever the Soundwave Project was, whatever they were planning, I hoped it would be enough. Because if it wasn't, I feared the hungry silence would eventually consume us all, leaving behind a world of eternal, empty quiet. With one last look at the noisy haven of the town square, I set off towards the unknown, the sound of my footsteps and the hum of my portable speaker the only things keeping the silence at bay. Each step was a defiance against the quiet, each breath a refusal to fade away. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was watching, waiting. It had already taken so much, our peace, our sleep, our loved ones. But I was determined it wouldn't take our future. Whatever the Soundwave Project had planned, I would be there to help, because in this world of hungry silence, making noise wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back. As I made my way through the eerily quiet streets, my portable speaker humming with artificial city sounds, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence seemed to press in from all sides, hungry and patient, waiting for the slightest lull in my defenses. I passed abandoned cars, their radios long dead, and empty storefronts with shattered windows. Tattered posters advertising noise-canceling headphones fluttered in the breeze, a cruel reminder of the world we'd lost. How foolish we'd been, seeking silence when it was the very thing that would come to hunt us. After what felt like hours of tense walking, I finally reached the address from the flyer. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, its weathered brick walls covered in graffiti. A hand-painted sign hung crookedly above the entrance. Soundwave Project Hope lives here. Taking a deep breath, I approached the heavy metal door and knocked, the sound echoing ominously in the quiet street. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt panic rising in my throat. Had I come all this way for nothing? Suddenly, a small viewport slid open, and a pair of bloodshot eyes peered out at me. "What's the password?" a raspy voice demanded. I hesitated, my mind racing. There had been no password on the flyer. I don't know any password, I admitted. I saw your flyer in the town square. I'm here to volunteer. The eyes narrowed suspiciously. Make a sound, the voice commanded. Any sound. Now, understanding dawned on me. This was the test. I quickly fumbled in my pocket and pulled out a small tin whistle, blowing a shrill note that pierced the silence. The viewport slammed shut, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd failed. Then, with a series of loud clanks and scrapes, the door swung open. Get in, quickly, the raspy-voiced man urged, ushering me inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, he slammed the doors shut and engaged a complex series of locks. I found myself in a large, dimly lit space filled with an assortment of machines, computers, and what looked like sound equipment. People bustled about, their movements creating a constant low-level noise that was oddly comforting after the tense silence outside. Welcome to the Soundwave Project, the man said, turning to face me. He was older than I'd expected, with wild gray hair and deep lines etched into his face. I'm Dr. Emerson. And you are? Alex, I replied, still taking in my surroundings. What exactly is this place? What are you working on? Dr. Emerson's eyes lit up with a fervent gleam. We're working on humanity's salvation, Alex. A way to fight back against the silence. He led me deeper into the warehouse, explaining as we walked. We've discovered that the silence isn't just an absence of sound. It's an entity, a form of energy that feeds on quiet. But more than that, it feeds on the potential for sound. We stopped in front of a large, complex-looking machine. Wires and tubes snaked out from its central core, connecting to various speakers and sensors. This, Dr. Emerson said, patting the machine fondly, is what we call the resonance engine. It doesn't just make noise, it creates a field of pure sonic potential. A space where sound is always on the verge of existing. I frowned, trying to wrap my head around the concept. But how does that help us? The silence can't enter a space filled with sonic potential, he explained excitedly. It's like trying to fill a glass that's already full. We've been testing it on a small scale, and it works. Now we're ready to go bigger. As if on cue, alarms began blaring throughout the warehouse. People rushed to their stations, a controlled chaos of movement and noise. What's happening? I shouted over the din. Dr. Emerson's face was grim. The silence. It's attacking the town square. My heart sank. The square had been our last major stronghold, the place where the most people had managed to survive. If it fell, we're not ready, Dr. Emerson muttered, more to himself than to me. The resonance engine isn't fully calibrated for a large-scale deployment, but we have to try, right? I urged. There are hundreds of people in that square. He looked at me, conflict clear in his eyes. Then he nodded sharply. You're right. We might not get another chance. He turned to the room at large. Prepare for emergency deployment. We move in 5 minutes. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The resonance engine was loaded onto a large truck, along with batteries, generators, and other equipment I couldn't identify. Volunteers, myself included, were given quick instructions on how to help set up and maintain the perimeter. As we sped towards the town square, I could see the silence's attack in progress. It was like watching a video being erased. Buildings, cars, and people were fading away, becoming transparent before disappearing entirely. The cacophony that had been the square's defense for so long was faltering, full of gaps and stutters. We screeched to a halt at the edge of the square. Move, move, move! Dr. Emerson shouted, and we leapt into action. The resonance engine was unloaded and set up in record time. People were screaming, the silence closing in from all sides. I saw a woman reach out to her child, only for her hand to pass right through as both of them faded away. Now! Dr. Emerson yelled, throwing the switch on the resonance engine. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then I felt it, a vibration in the air, in the ground, in my very bones. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but the promise of sound. Every atom around us seemed to hum with potential energy. The effect on the silence was immediate and stunning. Where it touched the field generated by the resonance engine, it recoiled as if burned. The fading stopped, and those who were partially transparent snapped back into full solidity. A cheer went up from the survivors, but Dr. Emerson remained focused. "Expand the perimeter," he ordered. "We need to push it back." We worked tirelessly, setting up relay stations to extend the resonance engine's field. Slowly but surely, we reclaimed the square, then the surrounding streets. The silence retreated, pushed back by our wall of sonic potential. As dawn broke, we stood on the edge of town, watching the silence roil and churn just beyond the boundary of our safe zone. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Dr. Emerson stood beside me, his face etched with exhaustion but his eyes bright with hope. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "We'll need to set up resonance engines all over the world. It'll take time, resources, and more volunteers than we have now. But we've proven it can be done. We can fight back." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, we had a real chance. As I looked out at the silent world beyond our bubble of safety, I realized something profound. We had been so focused on making noise to survive that we'd forgotten the true power of sound. It wasn't just about volume or constant noise. It was about potential, about the spaces between sounds, about the symphony of life itself. The hungry silence had tried to devour our world, but in doing so, it had taught us to truly appreciate the beauty of sound. And now, armed with that knowledge and the resonance engine, we would reclaim our world, one sonic space at a time. I took a deep breath, savoring the hum of potential in the air. The silence still lurked at the edges, patient and hungry as ever. But we were no longer afraid. We had found our voice, our weapon, our hope, and in the end, it wasn't the loudest noise that defeated the silence. It was the quiet promise of a sound yet to come. The end. Story number 2: The Shapeshifter's Revenge. Jake Malone's heart raced as he sped down the deserted highway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The duffel bag beside him bulged with stacks of crisp bills, the fruits of his latest heist. He allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. This score would set him up for life. The neon sign of a rundown motel flickered in the distance, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Jake's eyelids felt heavy after hours of driving. He decided to pull over for the night, confident he'd put enough distance between himself and the chaos he'd left behind. As he checked in, the motel clerk barely looked up from her magazine. Perfect. Jake liked to fly under the radar. He trudged to his room, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and collapsed onto the lumpy mattress. Sleep came quickly, but it was far from peaceful. In his dreams, Jake found himself back at the bank. But something was off. The faces of the terrified tellers and customers blurred and shifted, melting like wax. A chill ran down his spine as he realized they were all staring at him with identical, predatory grins. Jake jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The red numbers on the bedside clock read 3:07 a.m. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the nightmare. That's when he noticed it, a faint scratching sound coming from the bathroom. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice hoarse. No response, just more scratching. He reached for the gun tucked under his pillow, then slowly made his way to the bathroom door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He flung the door open, gun raised, ready to face whatever was inside. The bathroom was empty. Jake let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. He splashed some water on his face, avoiding his own reflection in the grimy mirror. As he reached for a towel, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. For just a split second, he could have sworn he saw something. A face pressed against the frosted glass of the shower door. But when he whirled around, there was nothing there. Jake stumbled back to bed, unnerved but exhausted. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Still, he kept the gun close as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Jake checked out early, eager to put more miles between himself and the botched robbery. As he loaded his bag into the car, he noticed the motel clerk watching him intently. There was something unsettling about her gaze, almost hungry. Jake shook off the feeling and peeled out of the parking lot. He drove for hours, only stopping for gas and to grab some greasy fast food. By nightfall, he'd crossed state lines. Another dingy motel, another restless night. This time, Jake dreamed of being chased through endless, twisting corridors. His pursuer was always just out of sight, but he could hear its ragged breathing, feel its hot breath on the back of his neck. He woke up screaming, sheets tangled around his legs. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, hunted. Every stranger's face seemed to hold a hint of malice. Every shadow concealed a potential threat. On the 5th night since the robbery, Jake found himself in a small town nestled in the mountains. The neon sign of Lou's Bar and Grill beckoned, promising a stiff drink to calm his frayed nerves. The bar was nearly empty, just a couple of grizzled locals nursing their beers. Jake slid onto a stool and ordered a whiskey, double. As the bartender poured his drink, Jake's gaze wandered to the TV mounted in the corner. His blood ran cold. There, on the screen, was his own face. The news anchor's voice droned on about a brutal bank robbery and a dangerous fugitive still at large. Jake knocked back his drink in one gulp, his mind racing. He needed to get out of town, fast. As he stood to leave, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jake spun around, ready to fight, only to find himself face to face with himself. The doppelganger grinned, its features rippling and shifting like water. Jake stumbled backward, knocking over his bar stool. The other patrons and the bartender were gone, leaving him alone with the creature. What are you? Jake gasped. The thing wearing his face chuckled, a sound like grinding glass. I'm Karma, Jake. And I've come to collect. Jake turned to run, but the exit door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. He whirled back to face the creature, only to find it had changed again. Now it wore the face of the security guard he'd gunned down during his escape from the bank. Remember me, Jake? The creature snarled, advancing slowly. You didn't even hesitate. Just pulled the trigger and left me to bleed out on the floor. Jake backed away, fumbling for his gun. Stay back, he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The shapeshifter laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. Oh, Jake. You can't shoot Karma. In desperation, Jake emptied his clip into the creature's chest. The bullets passed through it harmlessly, leaving ripples in its flesh like stones tossed into a pond. The thing that was no longer human lunged forward, its body stretching and warping impossibly. Jake screamed as it enveloped him, its flesh cool and gelatinous. He thrashed and fought, but it was like being swallowed by quicksand. Jake's world went dark. When he opened his eyes again, Jake found himself back in the bank. But this time, he wasn't the one holding the gun. He was behind the counter, staring down the barrel of his own weapon. The face of the robber, his face, sneered at him. No, Jake whispered. This isn't real. It can't be. The shapeshifter, still wearing Jake's face, leaned in close. Oh, it's real, Jake. And we're going to relive this day over and over. You'll feel the fear of every person you terrorized. You'll die 1,000 deaths, Just like that guard you murdered. Jake tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He watched in horror as his doppelganger pulled the trigger. Pain exploded in Jake's chest. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. As his vision faded, he heard the shapeshifter's voice one last time. "See you soon, Jake. We've got all of eternity to play." Darkness claimed him, but it brought no relief. Jake knew that when he opened his eyes again, the nightmare would start anew. His punishment had only just begun. In a seedy motel room hundreds of miles away, Jake Malone's body lay motionless on the bed, eyes wide and unseeing. The maid who found him the next morning would describe a look of pure terror frozen on his face. The coroner would be baffled. There were no signs of injury, no trace of drugs or poison in his system. It was as if Jake Malone had simply been scared to death, and in the realm between life and death, a shapeshifter savored its victory, ready to torment Jake's soul for all eternity. Karma, it seemed, had finally caught up with the bank robber. His ill-gotten gains lay forgotten in a duffel bag, a fortune that would do him no good where he was going. As for the shapeshifter, its work was far from done. There were always more wrongdoers in need of cosmic justice, more souls ripe for punishment. It slipped out of the motel unseen, already shifting its form, ready to hunt its next target. In the world of the living, Jake Malone would soon be forgotten. Just another criminal who met a mysterious end. But in the shapeshifter's realm, his screams would echo forever, a chilling reminder that karma always collects its due. The shapeshifter's revenge. Jake Malone's heart raced as he sped down the deserted highway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The duffel bag beside him bulged with stacks of crisp bills, the fruits of his latest heist. He allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. This score would set him up for life. The neon sign of a rundown motel flickered in the distance, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Jake's eyelids felt heavy after hours of driving. He decided to pull over for the night, confident he'd put enough distance between himself and the chaos he'd left behind. As he checked in, the motel clerk barely looked up from her magazine. Perfect. Jake liked to fly under the radar. He trudged to his room, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and collapsed onto the lumpy mattress. Sleep came quickly, but it was far from peaceful. In his dreams, Jake found himself back at the bank. But something was off. The faces of the terrified tellers and customers blurred and shifted, melting like wax. A chill ran down his spine as he realized they were all staring at him with identical, predatory grins. Jake jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The red numbers on the bedside clock read 3:07 a.m. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the nightmare. That's when he noticed it, a faint scratching sound coming from the bathroom. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice hoarse. No response, just more scratching. He reached for the gun tucked under his pillow, then slowly made his way to the bathroom door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He flung the door open, gun raised, ready to face whatever was inside. The bathroom was empty. Jake let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. He splashed some water on his face, avoiding his own reflection in the grimy mirror. As he reached for a towel, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. For just a split second, he could have sworn he saw something. A face, pressed against the frosted glass of the shower door. But when he whirled around, there was nothing there. Jake stumbled back to bed, unnerved but exhausted. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Still, he kept the gun close as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Jake checked out early, eager to put more miles between himself and the botched robbery. As he loaded his bag into the car, he noticed the motel clerk watching him intently. There was something unsettling about her gaze, almost hungry. Jake shook off the feeling and peeled out of the parking lot. He drove for hours, only stopping for gas and to grab some greasy fast food. By nightfall, he'd crossed state lines. Another dingy motel, another restless night. This time, Jake dreamed of being chased through endless, twisting corridors. His pursuer was always just out of sight, but he could hear its ragged breathing, feel its hot breath on the back of his neck. He woke up screaming, sheets tangled around his legs. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, hunted. Every stranger's face seemed to hold a hint of malice. Every shadow concealed a potential threat. On the 5th night since the robbery, Jake found himself in a small town nestled in the mountains. The neon sign of Lou's Bar and Grill beckoned, promising a stiff drink to calm his frayed nerves. The bar was nearly empty, just a couple of grizzled locals nursing their beers. Jake slid onto a stool and ordered a whiskey, double. As the bartender poured his drink, Jake's gaze wandered to the TV mounted in the corner. His blood ran cold. There, on the screen, was his own face. The news anchor's voice droned on about a brutal bank robbery and a dangerous fugitive still at large. Jake knocked back his drink in one gulp, his mind racing. He needed to get out of town, fast. As he stood to leave, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jake spun around, ready to fight, only to find himself face to face with himself. The doppelganger grinned, its features rippling and shifting like water. Jake stumbled backward, knocking over his bar stool. The other patrons and the bartender were gone, leaving him alone with the creature. What are you? Jake gasped. The thing wearing his face chuckled, a sound like grinding glass. I'm Karma, Jake. And I've come to collect. Jake turned to run, but the exit door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. He whirled back to face the creature, only to find it had changed again. Now it wore the face of the security guard he'd gunned down during his escape from the bank. Remember me, Jake? The creature snarled, advancing slowly. You didn't even hesitate. Just pulled the trigger and left me to bleed out on the floor. Jake backed away, fumbling for his gun. Stay back, he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The shapeshifter laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. Oh, Jake. You can't shoot Karma. In desperation, Jake emptied his clip into the creature's chest. The bullets passed through it harmlessly, leaving ripples in its flesh like stones tossed into a pond. The thing that was no longer human lunged forward, its body stretching and warping impossibly. Jake screamed as it enveloped him, its flesh cool and gelatinous. He thrashed and fought, but it was like being swallowed by quicksand. Jake's world went dark. When he opened his eyes again, Jake found himself back in the bank. But this time, he wasn't the one holding the gun. He was behind the counter, staring down the barrel of his own weapon. The face of the robber, his face, sneered at him. No, Jake whispered. This isn't real. It can't be. The shapeshifter, still wearing Jake's face, leaned in close. Oh, it's real, Jake. And we're going to relive this day over and over. You'll feel the fear of every person you terrorized. You'll die 1,000 deaths, just like that guard you murdered. Jake tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He watched in horror as his doppelganger pulled the trigger. Pain exploded in Jake's chest. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. As his vision faded, he heard the shapeshifter's voice one last time. See you soon, Jake. We've got all of eternity to play. Darkness claimed him, but it brought no relief. Jake knew that when he opened his eyes again, the nightmare would start anew. His punishment had only just begun. In a seedy motel room hundreds of miles away, Jake Malone's body lay motionless on the bed, eyes wide and unseeing. The maid who found him the next morning would describe a look of pure terror frozen on his face. The coroner would be baffled. There were no signs of injury, no trace of drugs or poison in his system. It was as if Jake Malone had simply been scared to death, and in the realm between life and death, a shapeshifter savored its victory, ready to torment Jake's soul for all eternity. Karma, it seemed, had finally caught up with the bank robber. His ill-gotten gains lay forgotten in a duffel bag, a fortune that would do him no good where he was going. As for the shapeshifter, its work was far from done. There were always more wrongdoers in need of cosmic justice, more souls ripe for punishment. It slipped out of the motel unseen, already shifting its form, ready to hunt its next target. In the world of the living, Jake Malone would soon be forgotten. Just another criminal who met a mysterious end. But in the shapeshifter's realm, his screams would echo forever, a chilling reminder that karma always collects its due. The end. Story number 3: The Thirst of Innocence. The Thirst of Innocence. In the quiet town of Pine Grove, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests, life moved at a leisurely pace. The kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, and secrets were as rare as city folk. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, an ancient evil was stirring, ready to shatter the peace and innocence of its inhabitants. Janice Holloway was just like any other 15-year-old girl in Pine Grove. She attended the local high school, spent her weekends at the mall with friends, and dutifully accompanied her parents to church every Sunday. Her life was ordinary, predictable, and safe. Until it wasn't. It began on a crisp autumn evening. Janice was walking home from her after-school job at the library when she felt a chill run down her spine. The shadows seemed to lengthen, reaching out with inky tendrils as if trying to grasp her ankles. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. That's when she heard it. A whisper, so faint she almost missed it. Janice, she spun around, expecting to see one of her classmates playing a prank. But the street behind her was empty, save for the rustling of fallen leaves and the breeze. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered her. Shaking her head, Janice convinced herself it was just her imagination running wild. She turned back towards home, unaware of the malevolent presence that had latched onto her, invisible and patient. Over the next few days, strange occurrences plagued Janice. Objects in her room would move on their own. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to lag behind her movements. And the whispers, they grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in, Janice. Let me show you power beyond your wildest dreams." She tried to ignore it, to carry on with her normal life. But the entity was relentless, wearing down her defenses day by day, night by night. On the 7th night, Janice's resolve finally crumbled. Exhausted from lack of sleep and constant fear, she whispered back to the voice, "What do you want from me?" The response was immediate, a cold caress against her mind. "I want to give you everything, my dear. All you have to do is say yes." Tears streaming down her face, Janice nodded. "Yes," she whimpered. "Just make it stop." In that moment, everything changed. A surge of energy coursed through her body, setting every nerve ending alight. She gasped, her back arching as an otherworldly presence flooded into her, filling every crevice of her being. When it was over, Janice stood up, but she was no longer alone in her own skin. The demon, an ancient entity known as Malphas, had taken residence within her. And it was hungry. Janice's eyes, once a warm brown, now glowed with an eerie red light. She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "Oh, the things we'll do together, my sweet vessel," Malphas purred, using Janice's voice but twisting it into something darker. The demon wasted no time. It began to whisper instructions to Janice, guiding her actions while feeding off her growing bloodlust. At first, it was small animals, neighborhood cats that went missing, dogs found drained of blood in back alleys. The townspeople were concerned, but no one suspected the quiet, polite Janice Holloway. But Malphas wasn't satisfied with mere animals. It craved human blood, and not just any human. It wanted someone pure, someone holy. The pastor, it whispered to Janice. His blood will make us unstoppable. Pastor David Green had been a fixture in Pine Grove for over 3 decades. He was beloved by his congregation, known for his kindness and unwavering faith. Every Sunday, he would deliver passionate sermons about love, forgiveness, and the power of belief. Little did he know that his newest parishioner harbored a darkness that threatened to consume not just him, but the entire town. Janice began to attend every service, sitting in the front row with an angelic smile on her face. She volunteered for church activities, helped with the bake sales, and even joined the youth choir. Pastor Green was delighted to see such enthusiasm from a young member of his flock. "You've become quite the pillar of our little community, Janice," he said to her one day after service. "Your parents must be very proud." Janice's smile widened, revealing just a hint of her now sharpened teeth. "Oh, I'm just getting started, Pastor. I have big plans for this town." As the weeks passed, Janice's influence grew. She whispered in the ears of her classmates, sowing discord and mistrust. She manipulated adults with a charm that seemed beyond her years. All the while, Malthus grew stronger, feeding off the negative energy that began to permeate Pine Grove. But it wasn't enough. The demon needed the pastor's blood to complete its transformation, to gain the power to break free from Janice's body and wreak havoc on a scale not seen since ancient times. The opportunity came on a stormy night in late October. Pastor Green was working late in his office, preparing for the upcoming All Saints' Day service. Thunder rumbled overhead as rain lashed against the windows of the small church. A knock on the door startled him from his work. "Come in," he called out, surprised to have a visitor so late. The door creaked open, revealing Janice. She was soaking wet, her clothes clinging to her small frame. "I'm sorry to bother you, Pastor," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need help." Pastor Green immediately stood up, concern etched on his kind face. "Janice, my dear, what's wrong? Come in, come in. Let's get you dried off." As Janice stepped into the office, lightning flashed, illuminating her face for a brief moment. In that instant, Pastor Green saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. But before he could react, the door slammed shut behind her. "You've been so kind to me, Pastor," Janice said, her voice changing, deepening. "So trusting. It almost makes me sad to do this." "Almost." Pastor Green backed away, his eyes wide with fear. "Janice, what's happening?" "This isn't you," Janice laughed, a sound that was far too old and cruel to come from a 15-year-old girl. "Oh, but it is me, Pastor. The real me. And I'm so very thirsty." She lunged forward with inhuman speed, her fingers elongating into claws. Pastor Green tried to defend himself, but he was no match for the demon-possessed girl. She tore into him, her teeth sinking into his neck as she began to drink deeply. As the pastor's life ebbed away, Malthus grew stronger. The demon's essence began to seep out of Janice, forming a dark, smoky silhouette around her. But something was wrong. The blood wasn't having the effect it should have. Janice pulled back, confusion and anger warring on her face. What's happening?" she snarled. Pastor Green, barely clinging to life, managed a weak smile. "The blood of the Lamb," he whispered, "protected by faith. You've damned yourself, child." Realization dawned on Janice's face, quickly replaced by horror. The demon had tricked her. The pastor's blood, rather than empowering Malthus, was like poison. She could feel it burning through her veins, fighting against the demonic presence within her. "No!" she screamed, her voice a mixture of Janice's terror and Malthus's rage. "This can't be happening!" But it was. The pastor's faith, even in death, was proving too strong for the demon to overcome. Janice fell to her knees, her body convulsing as a battle raged within her. Malphas fought to maintain control, to expel the holy blood from its host, but it was too late. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, Janice's body exploded in a burst of unholy light. When it faded, all that remained was a small, crumpled form on the floor of the pastor's office. The storm outside began to subside, the last rumbles of thunder fading into the distance. In the sudden silence, a soft sobbing could be heard. Janice, free from Malphas's influence, crawled over to Pastor Green's body. "I'm sorry," she wept, cradling his lifeless hand. "I'm so sorry." As sirens wailed in the distance, drawn by reports of strange lights and screams at the church, Janice closed her eyes. She knew her life would never be the same. The innocence of her youth was gone, shattered by the darkness she had invited in. In the days that followed, Pine Grove struggled to come to terms with the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The official story was that a disturbed drifter had attacked Pastor Green, and Janice had bravely fought him off at great cost to herself. It was easier for the town to believe that than to face the truth of the evil that had almost taken root among them. Janice, for her part, withdrew from the community. The weight of her actions, even under demonic influence, was almost too much to bear. But slowly, with the help of grief counselors and the unwavering support of her parents, she began to heal. Years later, long after most of Pine Grove had forgotten the details of that terrible night, Janice returned to the church. She stood before the congregation, her hands shaking but her voice strong. "I come before you today to share my testimony," she began. "To warn you about the darkness that exists in this world, and to remind you of the light that can drive it away. My story begins on a night much like any other, when I made a choice that nearly damned us all." As Janice spoke, the parishioners listened in rapt attention, unaware of the full truth behind her words. And in the shadows at the back of the church, a figure watched, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Malphas had been weakened, but not destroyed. It could afford to be patient. After all, there were always more innocent souls in need of temptation. The demon smiled, fading back into the darkness. The game, it seemed, was far from over. As Janice concluded her testimony, a hushed silence fell over the congregation. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, though none truly understood the depths of the horror she had experienced. She stepped down from the pulpit, her legs shaking slightly, and made her way back to her seat. The new pastor, a young man named Reverend Michael Thompson, took the stage. "Thank you, Janice, for your powerful message," he said, his voice filled with compassion. "Let us all take a moment to reflect on the importance of faith and vigilance in our daily lives." As the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, Janice felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced towards the back of the church, her eyes widening as she caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure. For a moment, she thought she saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at her. Panic gripped her heart. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." The figure seemed to smile, revealing a row of sharp teeth, before melting into the shadows. Janice blinked, and it was gone. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. Malphas was still out there, waiting. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences began to plague Pine Grove once again. Pets went missing, and there were whispers of dark shapes seen lurking in the woods at night. Janice felt the familiar tendrils of dread creeping into her mind. She knew she had to act. This time, she wouldn't be caught unprepared. Janice threw herself into research, poring over ancient texts and seeking out experts in demonology. She learned protective rituals, memorized exorcism rites, and fortified her mind against demonic influence. All the while, she kept a watchful eye on her town, determined to protect it from the evil she had once unwittingly invited in. One stormy night, much like the one that had changed her life years ago, Janice found herself standing at the edge of the woods. She could feel Malphas's presence, calling to her, trying to tempt her once more. "I know you're there," she called out, her voice steady despite her fear. "And I'm ready for you this time." The wind howled, and the trees seemed to bend unnaturally. From the darkness emerged a figure that was both familiar and alien. It wore the face of her 15-year-old self, but its eyes glowed with hellfire. "My sweet Janice," Malphas purred, using her own youthful voice. "Did you really think you could escape me? We have unfinished business, you and I." Janice stood her ground, drawing a vial of holy water from her pocket. "No," she said firmly. "We don't. You have no power over me anymore." The demon laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the forest. "Oh, but I do. I know your deepest fears, your darkest desires. I can give you power beyond your wildest dreams." For a moment, Janice felt the pull of temptation. The memory of the rush she had felt when Malphas first possessed her threatened to overwhelm her resolve. But then she remembered Pastor Green, and all the innocents who had suffered because of her weakness. "Never again," she growled, uncorking the vial. Malphas lunged forward, its form shifting into something monstrous and inhuman. But Janice was ready. She flung the holy water, reciting the words of exorcism she had practiced countless times. The demon shrieked as the blessed water made contact, its flesh sizzling and smoking. Janice pressed her advantage, continuing the ritual as she advanced on the writhing creature. "You are not welcome here, Malphas," she intoned, her voice growing stronger with each word. "By the power of faith and the light of the divine, I cast you out." The forest seemed to come alive around them, the wind whipping into a frenzy. Malphas fought back, lashing out with claws and teeth, but Janice's determination never wavered. She could feel the strength of her conviction flowing through her, bolstered by the memory of all those who had suffered. As she spoke the final words of the exorcism, a blinding light erupted from her chest. Malphas let out one last, terrible scream before it was engulfed by the radiance. When the light faded, the demon was gone, leaving behind nothing but a scorched patch of earth. Janice fell to her knees, exhausted but triumphant. She had faced her demons, quite literally, and emerged victorious. As the storm began to subside, she looked up at the clearing sky, a sense of peace washing over her for the first time in years. In the days that followed, Pine Grove slowly returned to normal. The strange occurrences ceased, and a sense of tranquility settled over the town. While most residents remained blissfully unaware of the battle that had taken place in their midst, Janice knew that her vigilance had made a difference. She continued to share her story, not just with her local congregation, but with others who had experienced similar brushes with the supernatural. Janice became a beacon of hope for those who had faced the darkness, proof that redemption and victory were possible. Years passed, and Janice grew older, but she never forgot the lessons she had learned. She remained a guardian of sorts for Pine Grove, always watchful for signs of otherworldly threats. And though she sometimes felt the weight of her past pressing down on her, she found strength in the knowledge that she had overcome the greatest evil of all, the darkness within herself. As for Malphas, its essence was scattered to the winds, weakened beyond measure. But in the darkest corners of the world, whispers of its name could still be heard. For evil, though it can be defeated, is never truly destroyed. It waits, patient and eternal, for the next unwary soul to stumble upon it. And so, the quiet town of Pine Grove continued on, its residents unaware of the invisible guardians that watched over them, chief among them a woman who had once danced with demons and lived to tell the tale. Janice Holloway, once a vessel for unimaginable evil, now stood as a testament to the enduring power of redemption, faith, and the indomitable human spirit. The end.